So in this presentation, we'll look at a brief survey of the Anglo-Saxons, grounding this period of study in some history, and then also looking at some things about culture and the literature of the time period. So prior to Roman rule, which we'll talk about in just a moment, England is very tribal. There's lots of primitive early religions, things like the Druids, kind of cool architectural things like Stonehenge, in which a lot of mystery is still around how those things were constructed. But it's not really until Julius Caesar eyes up Britain that England gets on the map. So originally, Caesar tries to do what Caesar did, which was seize stuff, and he tries to conquer England, but he finds it particularly difficult to control, certainly in some regions in which you have these very kind of brutish tribal cultures who are living in rocky and difficult areas to invade with Roman soldiers. So Agricola, who's a later Roman leader, has a change of tactics, and instead of trying to control Britain by force, he decides, according to Fraser, to do this. The warlike Celts were transformed into Roman citizens who took pride in wearing the toga. Agricola destroyed enmity from within. He deliberately took the sons of British chiefs and educated them in the Roman curriculum. Maybe you can call back to some of the stuff we talked about with Things Fall Apart, where Britain had similar kinds of tactics in India to imperialize that country, and the Romans, early imperializers, doing the same thing here in Britain. So you have this kind of interesting juxtaposition between, and I recognize the top left here is Scottish, but these are the kinds of like tribal groups that you have in early Britain. But then it's also being juxtaposed with the greatest civilization of the time, which is Roman rule. And with Roman rule as well, Christianity is coming into this country. So lots of different elements are swarming around, from a barbaric kind of ancestry to modern politics and modern religion, and to also then modern ideas about God and faith and justice. So in 410, the Roman Empire kind of has to start being a little bit more centered on itself, because things are kind of spiraling out of control and it's on its way to collapse. And so some of these groups that are on the fringe of the Roman Empire, like England all the way out west, and like Constantinople in Turkey all the way out east, start to be abandoned by Roman troops as they shrink the size of the empire. And when that happens, England is open now to invasion, and the history of this next little bit of time is of perpetual building and destruction and building and destruction. So in 460, Britain is invaded, and this essentially launches the whole country back to its pre-Roman origins. All of the Roman buildings are destroyed. Many of the records that were kept and the education system that had been in place are destroyed as well. In these small kind of enclaves with various monks who are hangovers or hangers-on from Roman religion, we see the preservation of the writing of Latin, and other kinds of important historical things are being kind of preserved in these monasteries. But culturally, at the time, a lot of those most recent histories are being destroyed and burned up as a result of these invasions. So two important kings of this era also represent two important juxtapositions between what's happening in this early community. So on the left-hand side here, you have Ethelbert of Kent, who just even in his picture, you can see with the halo around his head and the scepter that he's holding with the cross of Christ on top, is represented here as a Christian king. And yet Raedwald of East Anglia on the right-hand side represents for us this kind of Anglo-Saxon barbarism that is not Christian and is deeply connected to older ways of thinking about religion and man's place in the world. So these two kings, who have some brief overlap in their rule and also in their lifespan, represent again a kind of central juxtaposition at the core of early English politics and religion. So in this time, the Vikings invade, and as we've talked about a little bit in our conversations on Norse mythology, where the Vikings go, tremendous destruction goes as well. Thor and Woden, or Odin, are vengeful gods who believe that they believe in destruction, and they believe in importantly in things connected to death. And so in one of the history books that I'm drawing from, the quote is that today it would be as if all our public libraries and publishing houses and schools were burned to the ground systematically with never enough time to rebuild them. And when the Vikings invade England here, we have 200 years of this kind of destruction where the culture doesn't have a time to right itself or to remember itself. All these things are being destroyed with the Vikings. The Vikings, of course, are coming from Scandinavia, and they're coming across the sea here into Britain, on the Britain of the time period. So I want to show a brief clip from this movie called The Secret of Kells. While these Viking invasions are happening, again in these monasteries, some of the most beautiful artwork of the time is being created. And this on the right is a picture of an illuminated manuscript of the Bible. You can see the detail and the elaborate, painstaking amount of effort that's gone into crafting this single page of scripture in these monks in these monasteries. So I'm going to show you a brief clip of a film just to get a sense of Viking destruction.